The Baltic Sea churned with ice in the bitter January of 1945. The temperature had plunged to 20 degrees below zero, freezing the tears on Anna Holtz's face as she clutched her two young children close. Behind her, the sky glowed orange with the fires of Königsberg. Before her stretched the dark waters of the Baltic, her only hope of escape. "They're coming," whispered the old man next to her, his voice quavering with fear. "The Red Army will be here by nightfall." Anna pulled her children closer. 10-year-old Peter and 8-year-old Lena had already seen too much. Their father had not returned from the Eastern Front, and their grandmother had died on the brutal trek to the coast. For 2 weeks, they had walked through blizzards and slept in frozen barns, joining the massive flood of humanity fleeing westward. The harbor at Gotenhafen was chaos itself. Over 50,000 refugees crowded the docks, their breath forming a cloud of desperation that hung in the frigid air. Military police struggled to maintain order as people pushed forward, hoping to secure passage on any vessel that could carry them away from the advancing Soviet forces. The Wilhelm Gustloff. The name rippled through the crowd. A massive liner loomed at the dock, originally built to carry 1,500 holiday passengers in peacetime luxury. Now, in war's cruel reality, it would be crammed with as many souls as could fit within its steel walls. Anna's hands trembled as she clutched the small slip of paper, their tickets to salvation. A naval officer had given them priority boarding due to the children. It felt like blood money, she knew thousands would be left behind. "Papers," barked a port official as they reached the gangway. Anna handed over their documents with shaking hands. The man glanced at them briefly. "Proceed." Deck D, Section 18. As they shuffled forward, Anna glimpsed the ship's massive hull. Ice crusted its sides, and its white paint was chipped and faded from wartime neglect. This was no luxury cruise now. This was an ark in a different kind of flood. Inside, the corridors teemed with humanity. Every cabin designed for 4 now held 12 or more. The ship's dining rooms, swimming pool, and even hallways had been converted to sleeping areas. Naval personnel, wounded soldiers, young cadets, women, children, and the elderly all packed together in suffocating closeness. "Stay close," Anna told her children as they pushed through the crowd. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, fear, and sickness. Lena began to cry softly. "Is this where we sleep, Mama?" Peter asked, pointing to a small space on the floor of a corridor. Anna nodded, unable to speak. She laid down their few remaining possessions, a blanket, a small bundle of clothes, and a photograph of their father in his uniform. Everything else from their life had been abandoned on the long journey to the coast. A naval officer climbed atop a crate to address the crowd in their section. "The ship will depart at 2,100 hours. We expect to reach Kiel in 36 hours, weather permitting. The sea is dangerous, there are Soviet submarines hunting our vessels. Maintain discipline and follow all orders from the crew." A woman beside Anna began to sob. "My husband is still trying to get through the checkpoint," she said to no one in particular. "He has our other children with him." Anna touched the woman's arm gently. "Perhaps they will make it onto another ship." But they both knew the odds. Thousands would be left behind. As darkness fell, the massive engines of the Wilhelm Gustloff rumbled to life. Through the small porthole, Anna could see the desperate faces of those still on the dock, their hands reaching toward the departing vessel. Some jumped into the freezing water, trying to swim to the ship. Most were pulled under by the cold or crushed against the hull. The ship's whistle blew 3 long blasts as it pulled away from the pier. Around Anna, people began to pray, their whispered words in German, Polish, Lithuanian, and other tongues of the Baltic creating a soft murmur of hope. "Are we safe now, Mama?" Lena asked, her small face looking up with the first glimmer of hope Anna had seen in weeks. Anna stroked her daughter's hair. "Soon," she said. "Soon we will be." But as the massive ship pushed slowly through the ice-filled harbor, Anna felt a terrible weight in her chest. The Wilhelm Gustloff was dangerously overloaded. Naval officers had whispered that there were over 10,000 refugees aboard a vessel designed for a fraction of that number. And somewhere in the dark waters ahead, Soviet submarines prowled. The ship groaned as it turned westward into the open Baltic. Behind them, the eastern sky glowed with the fires of war. Ahead lay uncertainty. Anna closed her eyes and held her children, strangers pressed close on all sides. The greatest maritime evacuation in history had begun. Operation Hannibal was underway, though few aboard knew it by that name. They only knew they were running for their lives, across a frozen sea, on an overcrowded ship, through waters patrolled by enemies who showed no mercy. And none of them knew that they were part of a story that would be largely forgotten by history, despite dwarfing the famous evacuation at Dunkirk. For every soul saved at Dunkirk, Operation Hannibal would rescue 6. But first, they had to survive the night. As the lights of the coast faded into darkness, Anna whispered to her children, "Sleep now. Tomorrow we will be closer to our new home." But in her heart, she wondered if they would see tomorrow at all. 300 nautical miles away from the Wilhelm Gustloff, Admiral Karl Donitz paced the floor of his command center. Maps covered the walls, marked with red arrows showing the Soviet advance and blue lines indicating possible evacuation routes. The grim-faced admiral had made a decision that would go against Hitler's direct orders, but one that would save millions of lives. "We cannot abandon our people to the Soviets," he told his staff officers gathered around the table. "Every available vessel must be diverted to the eastern ports. Every ship that can float will be used." Captain Heinrich Bertram, a weathered naval officer with 30 years of service, studied the charts. "The Baltic is nearly frozen solid in places, sir. And there are Soviet submarines, at least 12 that we know of. And the Soviets have air superiority over much of the evacuation route," added another officer. Donitz slammed his fist on the table. "I am aware of the risks. But the alternative is unthinkable. 2 million civilians are trapped. Women, children, the elderly, all will face the Red Army's vengeance if we do nothing." The room fell silent. Reports of Soviet atrocities in East Prussia had reached them: entire villages slaughtered, women assaulted, children killed. The advancing Red Army was exacting revenge for 4 years of German occupation of Soviet territory. "The operation will be called Hannibal," Donitz continued. "Every merchant vessel, naval auxiliary, fishing boat, anything that floats and can make the journey, is to be commandeered. The evacuation will continue until either we have rescued everyone or—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. Back on the Wilhelm Gustloff, the morning brought no relief from the cramped conditions. Anna woke with Lena coughing beside her. The air was stale, with over 10,000 people breathing the same recycled atmosphere. Food was distributed sparingly: a thin soup and a small piece of bread. The toilets had stopped working hours ago. "Mama, I'm cold," Peter said, his face unusually pale. Anna wrapped her coat around both children. "We'll be warm soon. Just a little longer." But she knew the journey to Kiel would take at least another day, perhaps longer in these weather conditions. Throughout the ship, similar scenes played out. A pregnant woman went into labor in the former ballroom. Wounded soldiers lay on stretchers in the corridors, their bandages unchanged since boarding. Naval cadets as young as 15 huddled in groups, trying to maintain some military discipline amid the chaos. Meanwhile, across the Baltic ports, Donitz's orders were being implemented with German efficiency. In Palau, Danzig, Gotenhafen, and smaller harbors, ships of all shapes and sizes were being pressed into service. Captain Friedrich Weber of the merchant vessel Göttingen received his orders at dawn. "You are to proceed immediately to Palau. Load as many refugees as can safely be accommodated and transport them to Kiel or Copenhagen." "My ship is a cargo vessel, sir," Weber protested to the naval officer delivering the orders. "We have no passenger facilities. You have a deck and an engine room. That is sufficient. These people need passage west, not luxury accommodations." Throughout that day, an armada unlike any in history assembled in the eastern Baltic. Cruise ships, cargo vessels, fishing trawlers, military supply ships, and even tugboats joined the massive evacuation fleet. At harbors along the coast, desperate people crowded onto anything that could take them away from the advancing Soviet forces. Captain Joseph Kruger of the fishing vessel Hellas Fortune had never carried more than his crew of 8 and their catch. Now, 65 refugees crammed onto his small boat. "We'll have to pray for calm seas," he told his first mate as they cast off. "We're sitting dangerously low in the water." Back aboard the Wilhelm Gustloff, the afternoon brought worsening weather. The ship pitched in heavy seas, causing many passengers to become violently ill. With no proper ventilation and overcrowded conditions, the smell became unbearable. "Attention all passengers," came an announcement over the ship's speakers. "We have received reports of Soviet submarine activity in the area. All civilians are to remain calm and follow crew instructions. Blackout conditions will be strictly enforced after sunset." Anna felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "What does that mean, Mama?" Peter asked. "It means we must be very quiet and use no lights tonight," she explained, trying to keep the fear from her voice. As darkness fell, the ship's crew moved through the corridors, ensuring that no light could be seen from outside. The massive vessel continued its slow progress through the stormy Baltic, now just one of hundreds of ships involved in Operation Hannibal. In his command center, Admiral Donitz received the first reports of success. Over 25,000 evacuated from Palau in the last 24 hours, an aide reported. The Potsdam has successfully reached Copenhagen with 3,000 refugees. The Cap Arcona has taken on passengers at Gotenhafen. But there was troubling news as well. Soviet submarines have been spotted near the main evacuation route. 2 merchant vessels were torpedoed off Bornholm. And the weather forecast is deteriorating. Donitz studied the map. "Order all ships to maintain blackout conditions and zigzag courses. Escort vessels are to drop depth charges at regular intervals, regardless of whether submarines are detected." Throughout that night, the evacuation continued. Fishing boats braved ice floes to reach stranded groups on coastal peninsulas. Hospital ships took on wounded civilians alongside military casualties. Cargo vessels designed for coal or timber now carried human cargo. On the Wilhelm Gustloff, Anna tried to sleep but found it impossible. The ship's constant pitching, the cries of children, and her own fear kept her wide awake. Sometime after midnight, a loud explosion in the distance caused many to cry out in panic. "Another ship," whispered an elderly man nearby. The Soviets got another ship. By dawn, the Wilhelm Gustloff had made good progress, but still had hours of dangerous travel ahead. The captain ordered additional lookouts posted, searching for submarine periscopes or the wakes of torpedoes. Everyone knew they were sailing through hunting grounds. And as the sun rose on the second day of Operation Hannibal, none aboard realized they were part of the greatest maritime evacuation in history, one that would eventually save over 2 million lives, dwarfing the famous rescue at Dunkirk. But first, they had to survive the journey across the deadly Baltic Sea, where Soviet submarines waited and where the freezing waters showed no mercy to those who fell into their grasp. Night fell again on the Baltic Sea, bringing with it a bone-chilling cold that seemed to penetrate the very hull of the Wilhelm Gustloff. The ship continued its labored progress through heavy seas, listing slightly to port due to uneven weight distribution of its human cargo. Most passengers had now gone almost 48 hours with minimal food and water. Anna had managed to secure a small corner near a heating pipe for her children. Peter's fever had worsened, his forehead burning hot despite the cold air. "Just a little longer," she whispered, dabbing his face with a damp cloth torn from her slip. "Stay strong for Mama." At 9 p.m., an announcement crackled over the ship's intercom. "All passengers remain calm. We have altered course due to reported submarine activity. Maintain blackout conditions." The ship lurched as it turned northward, seeking deeper waters where submarines might be less effective. The sudden movement sent people and possessions sliding across floors. A child's cry pierced the darkness, followed by soothing whispers from exhausted parents. In the ship's bridge, Captain Friedrich Petersen studied the radar screen with growing concern. 3 contacts, possibly Soviet naval vessels, he informed his first officer. "We're increasing speed." The massive engines of the Wilhelm Gustloff strained as the captain ordered more power. The ship was designed for leisurely cruises, not running blockades. Every rivet and weld groaned under the stress. At 9:16 p.m., the lookout's cry shattered the tense silence. Periscope. Port side. Before the captain could order evasive action, 3 torpedoes streaked through the dark waters toward the packed refugee ship. The first struck near the bow, the second hit amidships, and the third detonated by the engine room. The explosions ripped through steel and flesh alike. The Wilhelm Gustloff shuddered violently. Emergency lights flickered on, revealing scenes of chaos. Water rushed in through massive breaches in the hull. The ship immediately began to list heavily. Abandon ship. The order came over the intercom, barely audible over screams and the groaning of failing metal. Proceed calmly to your designated lifeboat stations. But there was nothing calm about what followed. With over 10,000 people aboard a ship designed for 1,500, most had no designated lifeboat. The few available lifeboats were quickly overwhelmed. Some broke free of their davits, crashing down onto the crowds below. Anna grabbed Peter and Lena. "Hold on to me," she shouted above the din, "don't let go no matter what." They pushed through panicked crowds toward the upper decks. The ship's list was growing more severe by the minute. People slid across the tilting floors, some falling into rapidly flooding compartments. On the starboard side, Naval Lieutenant Wilhelm Zahn had taken charge of loading a lifeboat. "Women and children first," he bellowed, physically restraining desperate men who tried to push past. "There are other vessels responding to our distress call. Everyone will be rescued." Whether this was true or a necessary lie to maintain order, no one knew. But Zahn's authoritative presence brought a small measure of organization to one corner of the dying ship. Anna reached the lifeboat station, children in tow. Lena was sobbing uncontrollably. Peter, despite his fever, remained eerily silent, his eyes wide with shock. "3 more!" Zahn shouted, pulling Anna and her children into the already dangerously overloaded lifeboat. "Lower away." The lifeboat descended jerkily toward the churning sea below. Halfway down, one of the cables jammed. The boat tilted, nearly spilling its occupants into the freezing water. A young naval cadet climbed up the stuck cable, working desperately to free it while hanging precariously over the dark waters. "He'll fall," whispered Lena. But the young man succeeded. The lifeboat continued its descent, hitting the water with a jarring impact that knocked several people off their seats. "Row," Zahn ordered. "We must clear the ship before she goes down." Those with oars began to row frantically. Anna held her children close, watching in horror as the massive hull of the Wilhelm Gustloff continued to roll onto its side. People clung to railings, some jumping or falling into the sea. The water temperature was just above freezing, survival time measured in minutes, not hours. 20 minutes after being hit, the Wilhelm Gustloff slipped beneath the waves. The suction pulled nearby lifeboats toward the sinking vessel. Anna's boat barely escaped the vortex. All around them, the sea was filled with thrashing figures, their cries growing weaker as hypothermia took hold. "We must try to pull some aboard," a woman said, reaching toward a floating figure. "The boat will capsize if we take on more," argued another. "We're already sitting too low." Lieutenant Zahn made the agonizing decision, row between them. "Pull aboard any children you can reach. For the others, God forgive us." Anna watched as hands reached up from the water, pleading for help that couldn't come. She covered Lena's eyes but couldn't shield her from the sounds. Meanwhile, other ships in the evacuation fleet had received the Wilhelm Gustloff's distress call. The torpedo boat T-36, despite the danger of Soviet submarines still lurking in the area, raced toward the sinking ship's last reported position. Captain Robert Herring of the T-36 ordered all lights on, despite the risk. "We can't find survivors in the dark," he told his concerned first officer. "The submarine has likely moved on to find other targets." When the T-36 arrived at the scene, the sea was littered with debris and bodies. Most had already succumbed to the cold. Searchlights swept the water, locating scattered lifeboats and rafts. "There." A crewman pointed to Anna's lifeboat, now half filled with icy water as the survivors bailed desperately with bare hands. The T-36 maneuvered alongside, and sailors helped the hypothermic survivors aboard. Anna could no longer feel her legs as she handed up first Lena, then the nearly unconscious Peter. When her turn came, her frozen fingers couldn't grip the rope ladder. 2 sailors climbed down to carry her up. Throughout that night, the T-36 and other rescue vessels pulled 1,252 survivors from the sea. But the Wilhelm Gustloff had carried over 10,000. It remains the deadliest maritime disaster in history, claiming 6 times more lives than the Titanic. Yet even as the Wilhelm Gustloff tragedy unfolded, Operation Hannibal continued. Other ships slipped past Soviet submarines, delivering thousands to safety. Admiral Donitz received news of the disaster with grim resolve. "The evacuation will continue," he told his staff. "Double the escort vessels if possible, but the ships will sail. Those people will not be abandoned." In the medical bay of the T-36, Anna sat between her children's cots. Peter's fever had broken, ironically perhaps because of his brief immersion in the freezing Baltic. Lena slept fitfully, crying out in her dreams. A naval officer approached with a cup of thin soup. "You're being taken to Kiel," he informed her. "Medical ships are waiting there." "How many?" Anna couldn't finish the question. The officer understood. "Over 9,000 lost," he said quietly. "But you and your children survived. Focus on that." As dawn broke over the Baltic, Anna looked out a small porthole at the grey waters that had nearly claimed them. Other ships of the evacuation fleet were visible in the distance, each carrying hundreds or thousands of refugees like herself. The Wilhelm Gustloff was gone, but Operation Hannibal continued. In the coming weeks, thousands more would be saved, and other ships would be lost. It was both tragedy and triumph on a scale almost too vast to comprehend, a desperate race against time, the advancing Soviet forces, and the merciless sea. Spring sunshine bathed the German port city of Kiel as Anna Holtz stood on the dock, watching ships still arriving from the east. 3 months had passed since the night the Wilhelm Gustloff went down, taking thousands of souls with it. Yet the massive evacuation operation that Admiral Donitz had named Hannibal continued, even as Germany itself collapsed around them. "It's remarkable," said Dr. Heinrich Weber, who had treated Peter's pneumonia after their rescue. He now stood beside Anna, clipboard in hand as he prepared to meet yet another vessel packed with refugees. 2 million people evacuated by sea. History has never seen anything like it. Anna nodded silently. The number was almost impossible to comprehend, 2 million lives saved from the advancing Soviet forces. 6 times more than the famous evacuation at Dunkirk, which the British celebrated as a miracle. "Why do you think no one talks about it?" Anna asked, adjusting her scarf against the spring breeze. 2 million people saved, yet the world says nothing. Dr. Weber sighed. "We're the losing side in this war. Our victories, even humanitarian ones, aren't stories the victors wish to tell." In the distance, a battered cargo ship was making its slow approach to the harbor. Its decks were crowded with refugees, just as all the others had been. Operation Hannibal was still saving lives, even as Berlin itself fell to Soviet forces. Peter and Lena played nearby with other refugee children, chasing each other between stacks of crates. Despite everything they had witnessed, children's resilience showed in their ability to find moments of joy. Peter had recovered from his illness, though a lingering cough still troubled him at night. "They're saying the war will end any day now," Dr. Weber commented, checking his watch. "The Americans and British are approaching from the west, the Soviets from the east." Anna felt a chill despite the warm day. "What happens to all of us then? We have no homes to return to." This was the unspoken fear among all the refugees. Their homes in East Prussia, Pomerania, and the Baltic states were now behind the Soviet lines. Most had lost everything, their homes, possessions, and often family members. They were alive, but adrift in a collapsing nation. As the cargo ship docked, Anna and Dr. Weber moved to help. After her own rescue, Anna had volunteered to assist new arrivals, knowing too well the shock and disorientation they felt. Today's ship brought another 900 souls to safety, mostly elderly, women, and children. Among them was an old fisherman who moved slowly down the gangplank, clutching a small wooden chest, likely all he had managed to save. "Where are you from?" Anna asked, helping him onto the dock. "Palau," he replied, his voice rough with exhaustion. "I waited until the last ship. My sons didn't make it." The simple statement contained worlds of grief. Anna nodded, understanding too well. "Come, there's soup and a place to rest." As she guided him toward the refugee center, a military vehicle pulled up to the dock. An American officer stepped out, accompanied by two British men in civilian clothes. "Journalists," Dr. Weber whispered to Anna. "The Allies are finally taking notice." The American officer addressed Dr. Weber in broken German. "We're documenting the end of hostilities. I understand this evacuation has been quite extensive." Dr. Weber straightened his shoulders with a hint of pride. "Operation Hannibal has evacuated over 2 million civilians from the Eastern Territories since January. The largest maritime evacuation in history." The British journalists exchanged skeptical glances. 2 million, one repeated. "That seems rather exaggerated, doesn't it?" Dr. Weber's face flushed. "I have the records, sir. Every ship, every port, every arrival. We've kept meticulous count." The American officer intervened diplomatically. "We'd be interested in seeing those figures. For the historical record." Anna stepped forward, still supporting the old fisherman. "I was on the Wilhelm Gustloff," she said quietly. "Over 10,000 people on one ship. Most were lost." The journalist's expression softened slightly. One made a note in his pad. "We'd like to hear your story, ma'am." But Anna knew, even as she nodded, that her story, and the larger story of Operation Hannibal, would likely be forgotten. The world was not ready to acknowledge that amid the horrors perpetrated by the Nazi regime, this act of humanity had occurred, German sailors and civilians risking everything to save their countrymen. 6 weeks later, on a farm in Bavaria where Anna and her children had been given temporary housing, she read the small newspaper article about the evacuation. 3 paragraphs, buried on page 7. The journalist had quoted her briefly but mentioned nothing of the operation's scale. Dunkirk remained celebrated, Hannibal was already fading into obscurity. "Is this where we live now, Mama?" Lena asked, helping to feed the farmer's chickens. Anna looked at the rolling Bavarian hills, so different from their coastal home in East Prussia. "For now," she answered. "Until we find something permanent." Peter, now healthier and stronger, was helping the farmer mend a fence. "I like it here," he called to his mother. "Herr Muller says I have a talent for carpentry." Anna smiled, watching her son work. From the tragedy had come unexpected gifts: Peter's discovered aptitude, Lena's growing confidence, and the simple miracle of their survival. That evening, as summer twilight lingered, the farmer's wife invited other refugee families for a small gathering. Among them was Captain Friedrich Weber of the merchant vessel Göttingen, now working as an agricultural inspector since the merchant fleet had been surrendered to the Allies. "I carried over 3,000 people to safety in 4 voyages," he told the small group as they sat in the farmhouse kitchen. "Nearly lost the ship in a storm on the 3rd trip. But we got through." Similar stories came from others: harrowing escapes, brave rescues, terrible losses, and remarkable survivals. Each person there represented a life saved from Operation Hannibal, each with family members who might not otherwise have lived. "My grandson was born last week," an elderly woman announced proudly. "In Hanover. He would never have existed if not for the evacuation." Anna thought of the mathematical progression: how many thousands of children and grandchildren would someday exist because of those saved? How many contributions to the world would come from the descendants of the 2 million evacuated? Years later, in 1955, Anna stood with her children on the Hamburg docks. Peter, now 20, was preparing to board a merchant vessel as an apprentice carpenter. Lena, 18, waved excitedly beside her. "It's different, leaving by choice," Peter said, adjusting his cap. Not running from anything. Anna nodded, touching the small photograph she always carried, her husband in uniform, lost somewhere on the Eastern Front. Your father would be proud of the man you've become. As Peter's ship departed, Anna reflected on how life had unfolded after Operation Hannibal. The displaced refugees had helped rebuild West Germany's economy, bringing skills and determination born of their hardships. What had seemed like an ending had become a beginning. Yet the story of their rescue remained largely untold. History books mentioned Dunkirk in detail but gave only passing reference to the Baltic evacuation, if they mentioned it at all. The Wilhelm Gustloff tragedy, despite its scale, became a footnote rather than a chapter. Does it bother you, Mama? Lena asked as they walked from the docks. That no one remembers what happened? Anna considered the question carefully. We remember, she said finally. Those of us who lived it. And perhaps that's enough. Not every great deed needs celebration to have meaning. They passed a newsstand where headlines announced increasing tensions between East and West, the Cold War deepening. The lands they had fled remained behind the Iron Curtain, inaccessible and transformed. The real victory wasn't just surviving, Anna told her daughter. It was finding the strength to build new lives. 2 million people got that chance because sailors and captains and ordinary people decided that saving lives mattered more than anything else. Even if history books don't tell the story, that decision changed the world. As they turned toward home, a small but comfortable apartment Anna had purchased with years of careful saving, she felt a profound sense of peace. The forgotten maritime miracle had given her children a future, and through them, the rescue would echo forward in time in ways no history book could measure. In the grand ledger of human events, Operation Hannibal stood as proof that even in humanity's darkest hour, the light of compassion could still shine, saving 2 million lives one ship at a time, in the greatest sea rescue the world has ever known, yet seldom remembers.